Hello listeners, welcome to our YouTube channel Vishwakul. In today's episode we will talk on the topic, India rejects $300 billion climate deal. Also we need to understand, why is India unhappy with the COP29 deal? Every year, countries from around the world come together for a big climate summit under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. This year, the 29th Conference of Parties, or COP29, took place in Baku, Azerbaijan. These meetings aim to tackle climate change by setting goals, discussing funding, and finding ways to cut greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. But COP29 wasn't just about ambitious goals, it quickly turned into a clash of interests, unkept promises, and growing frustration, especially for India. Let's break down what happened, focusing on India's decision to reject the $300 billion climate finance deal and its strong stance on fossil fuels. This year's summit was hosted by Azerbaijan, a country that heavily depends on exporting fossil fuels. This choice sparked controversy from the start, with critics accusing Azerbaijan of favoring oil and gas interests during its presidency. The main issues at COP29 included setting a new climate finance goal to replace the $100 billion annual pledge made back in 2009. Deciding whether to phase down or completely phase out fossil fuels. Establishing rules for carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. India found itself at the center of heated debates on both climate finance and fossil fuels. Let's break these issues down. So, where did this $300 billion figure come from? That's the big question, and to answer it, we need to look back at how the climate finance conversation started. In 2009, during COP15 in Copenhagen, developed countries promised to mobilize $100 billion every year by 2020. The idea was to help developing nations adapt to climate change and reduce their emissions. But here's the catch, the $100 billion wasn't based on any detailed analysis of actual needs. Experts later criticized it as a convenient number, more about politics than addressing real problems. It was meant to satisfy developing countries without committing to something too ambitious. The money was supposed to be split between two main goals. Mitigation, which focuses on preventing climate change, like investing in solar and wind energy. Adaptation, which helps countries cope with its effects, like building flood defenses or developing drought-resistant crops. Unfortunately, most of the funding ended up going to mitigation, leaving adaptation, which poorer countries rely on, seriously underfunded. So, how did it all play out? The $100 billion target wasn't met on time. According to the OECD, $83.3 billion was mobilized in 2020 and $89.6 billion in 2021. Early estimates suggest the goal was only finally reached in 2022. But these numbers are hotly debated. Organizations like Oxfam argue that the real amount is much lower, around $24.5 billion, once you strip out loans and inflated private sector claims. To make matters worse, the definition of climate finance is fuzzy. Many countries include spending that isn't directly related to climate action or count guarantees that don't translate into real funds for mitigation or adaptation projects. At COP29, developed nations pitched a new goal, mobilizing $300 billion annually by 2035. India's response: outrage. Indian officials slammed the proposal as a joke and accused Azerbaijan's presidency of stage managing the talks to favor developed countries. In a sharply worded statement, India said, "This has been stage managed, and we are extremely disappointed." India believes this $300 billion commitment, just like the $100 billion pledge before it, isn't a serious plan to tackle climate change. To India, it's nothing more than a band-aid. Officials pointed out that India's own climate goals require at least $2.5 trillion by 2030, roughly $250 billion annually. Why does India need so much? Energy transition. India's goal of 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030 demands massive investments in solar, wind, and the infrastructure to support these systems. Adaptation. As one of the most climate-vulnerable countries, India has to prepare for floods, droughts, and heat waves, which are expected to worsen in the future. Building resilient infrastructure comes with a hefty price tag. Coal dependency. Half of India's electricity still comes from coal. Transitioning to renewable energy while ensuring a stable energy supply is a monumental challenge. When just one country like India requires such enormous funding, the $300 billion global proposal falls drastically short for all developing nations combined. To make things worse, much of this funding would come as private financing, especially loans, which developing countries would eventually have to repay. This shifts the financial burden onto them instead of offering real support through grants. Another major sticking point at COP29 was the debate over fossil fuels. Should the world commit to phasing them out entirely, stopping the use of coal, oil, and gas, or settle for phasing them down, simply reducing their use over time? The controversy hit a boiling point when Saudi Arabia was accused of editing official negotiation texts. Normally, these documents are shared as non-editable PDFs to ensure transparency and fairness. However, reports surfaced that Saudi delegates had changed the wording from phase out fossil fuels to phase down. This sparked outrage, with climate experts warning that such actions undermine the credibility of the negotiations and reflect a strategic effort to stall real progress. Many developed nations, led by the EU, pushed for a strong commitment to completely phase out fossil fuels. Their argument is straightforward: if the world is serious about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to stop burning fossil fuels as soon as possible. India strongly opposed a complete phase out of fossil fuels, calling it an unfair demand for several reasons. Historical responsibility: developed countries industrialized using fossil fuels for centuries, contributing the most to global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, they expect developing countries like India, which are still growing, to abandon coal and other fuels, even though they've benefited from them for decades. Economic realities: coal still generates 50% of India's electricity. Phasing it out too quickly would raise energy costs, hurt industries, and slow economic growth. For millions in rural areas who rely on affordable electricity, this would be devastating. India supported a phase-down approach instead, insisting that developed nations must take the lead by transitioning first and providing financial and technological support to help others follow. However, this position was weakened by backstage negotiations. In the end, the talks ended in a deadlock. The final agreement avoided any binding commitments on either phasing out or phasing down fossil fuels, leaving the issue unresolved. This was seen as a victory for oil exporting countries and a setback for ambitious climate action. India's rejection of the $300 billion climate finance deal wasn't just about the money, it was about fairness. At COP29, developed nations failed to offer meaningful support to developing countries, giving vague promises instead of real action. The unresolved fossil fuel debate only deepened the divide, with behind-the-scenes maneuvering further eroding trust. As we look ahead to COP30 in Brazil, one big question looms: can global climate action ever truly be fair, or will the gap between the global north and global south keep growing? Thank you for watching our video. Do share this with your friends. Subscribe to our channel Vishwakul for more such interesting contents. And do hit a like button on our video.